Good morning and welcome to the National Newspaper Publishers Association, Let It Be Known, with Stacy Brown. I am obviously not Stacy Brown. I am James Wright. I'm substituting for him today. This morning, we're going to discuss the importance of historically Black colleges and universities and what Vice President Kamala Harris, a proud HBCU alum, said during her first commencement address at an HBCU as Vice President at Tennessee State University in Nashville. But first, another historic first by a Black woman, thanks to the Biden-Harris administration. Dr. Lisa Cook, Michigan State University economics professor Lisa Cook, is the latest administration nominee to break the glass ceiling, this time on the U.S. Federal Reserve Board. Cook, well known for her work on racial and gender equality, won Senate confirmation as the first Black woman to serve on the federal board in the agency's 109-year history. The history-making moment required a tie-breaking vote in the Senate from Vice President Kamala Harris, who, by the way, is the first Black woman to hold her position. Each of the Senate's 50 GOP members voted against Cook, while all 50 Democrats and independents and Harris cast their ballots in favor of the nomination. The federal board needs governors who understand how the economy works across race, gender, and class. Dr. Cook's deep expertise makes her exceptionally qualified to serve. Michelle Holder, president of the Washington Center for Equitable Growth, wrote in a statement. An advisor on the Biden-Harris and Obama-Biden transition team, Cook will help set fiscal policy on the federal board. And by the way, I do want to say that the first Black to serve on that particular board was a man by the name of Dr. Emmett Rice. And if the last name sounds somewhat familiar, it is because that is the father of Susan Rice, who served as the National Security Advisor and UN ambassador for the Obama administration. And since we're talking about Black progress, we need to come on and talk about historically Black colleges and universities. And I would like to bring in the guest if this is what we would like to do. And while we're doing that, the first time Kamala Harris wrote on Marine 2 as Vice President of the United States, the helicopter circled around her alma mater, Howard, as I previously mentioned, in D.C. She said, you see, HBCUs like this, well, they are a cathedral of education, she said, and she mentioned this in her commencement. The value of this education is that it teaches you something very special, that yes, you can be anything and do anything. This was her first address, as I previously mentioned, addressing HBCU graduates as the vice president. And she shared a little bit about her experience as an HBCU alum to the class of 2022. As Kyra Watts wrote in a local Tennessee newspaper, some people form misconceptions about HBCUs from the outside looking in. People have told me they think they're just party schools that provide a low-budget education to Black students who won't be able to obtain gainful employment or adapt to the workforce. I'm here to tell you that is false. Vice President Harris's speech highlighted that a 2015 Gallup USA poll mentioned that poll finds that Black HBCU graduates were more prepared for life and more likely to be engaged at work than graduates of predominantly white institutions. Although HBCUs make up only 3% of America's colleges and universities, they enroll 10% of all African-American students and produce almost 20% of all African-American graduates. They enroll almost 300,000 students, approximately 80% of whom are African-American, and 70% are from low-income families. And according to the report, the nation's 107 HBCUs generate $14.8 billion in economic impact annually. They produce 25% of African American graduates with science, technology, STEM degrees, and are the origin among almost 30% of Black graduates of science and engineering doctorate programs. Let us on and let's bring on the guests, please. Well, it's good to see your nice smiling faces, and let's get right on this topic. We will start, ladies first. Someone I'm very familiar with, Vicki Wright Smith. Vicki Wright Smith is a graduate of Penn State University, but she opted to go to Howard University School of Law in order to further her education. And then we have Al McFarland, the publisher in Minnesota of the Minneapolis Spokesman, very powerful institution. You're on mute. Um, and um, and he is a graduate of, please tell us. Okay, you're on mute. You're on mute. There you go. You're still on mute. Well, anyway, while we're working with Al, Vicky, could you talk about your experience in terms of being, uh, uh, talk about, I'll get straight to it. Why did you decide to attend an HBCU in terms of your law school experience?
I had to. Quite frankly, I had to. I grew up in Lancaster, Pennsylvania, I considered a diverse population, and thought would have me prepared to go to Penn State. But dealing with the white people up there, and to Penn State's credit, they were trying to increase the number of minorities there, but I still don't think they had to. They've reached that goal to this day. And so leaving there, I just said I got to be around my people. And my brother, he knew what was going on at Penn State, so he invited me to Howard for a homecoming. I came to the homecoming, had an absolute blast. So when I sent out my applications for law school, and Howard accepted me, I knew at that point I was going back to the Mecca, and it was a great decision for me, and I have no regrets at all.
Okay. Thank you very much. Al, do we have you? Okay, we're still having some technical problems in terms of you being muted. Okay, we'll go back. There's an old adage, and you've heard this, Vicky, that if you want to quote make it in the world, you have to go. It's okay to go to a black college, but you have to go to a white graduate school, a law school, medical school, et cetera, et cetera. Could you please debunk that myth?
Yeah, my immediate reaction is that's a lie. That's a total lie and a fabrication. Penn State was great. I have no regrets going there, but I do feel like Howard prepared me for the real world. I mean, Penn State prepared me in terms of dealing with white people, but in terms of being social engineers and doing service in this community and being of service to the people around you, I do felt like I got that from Howard. It's a very nurturing place. It wasn't the easiest place, and you know that, James. But you make it, and you just feel like you can make a change in the world and a difference in the world when you come from HBCU, in my opinion.
You know, one of the most interesting alumni from Howard University in general, and specifically the law school, is I guess you call him Reverend. I'm not an Episcopalian, but Reverend Paula Murray. Could you talk a little bit about Paula Murray, and why do you think it's important that people note that she is an HBCU alum?
Yeah, and for those of you that don't know, Netflix or one of those platforms just did a movie about her, and I did have the opportunity to watch it, and it is fantastic. And if you get the chance, you should absolutely do so. Actually, it was Prime Video that did it, and I learned things listening and watching that movie. I think I left away with a quote, and I was trying to find it, and I haven't been able to do that. But she started off as a very prominent civil rights attorney, and then moved on to the Episcopalian church side and blossomed there as well. So, you could do whatever you want to do in this world. You just have to find the passion to do it. And she found her passion. And if you, like I said, if you get a chance to watch that movie, it's not long, and you will be inspired. You absolutely will be. I know I was. It was something in there about getting busy doing something, and from that moment on, that's exactly what I've been doing. Just trying to get out here, be of service in this community. I focus mainly on estate work, so trying to help people get their affairs in order, because you just will not believe the number of people that leave this world and do not have wills, just simple wills. And so it was something that she did, that she's a very inspiring woman, and we should all watch that movie on Prime Video and get inspired and do great in the world.
There was a book about her that came out in 1989. It escapes me in terms of who wrote the book, but I actually read that book, and I actually remember aspects of it. I mean, Paula Murray, she led protests in Washington, D.C. in the 1940s. And this was, way before the lunch counters in the 1960s at North Carolina A&T. And she was kind of old. I shouldn't say that. She was older than her typical students when she entered law school in the 1940s. And matter of fact, she guided many of them at that time. And she did a lot of things that were quite unheard of at that time. Let me segue to Al. Al, do we have you? Okay,
Oh, wow.
we still
What
don't
is
have you,
going
Al.
on?
And as you probably know, Vicky, they're setting up in her home in North Carolina. They're setting up a monument to her. They're finally getting around to it,
Right.
recognizing her as an LGBTQ member of the community, which would not have been done about 30 years ago. Could you talk about how unusual she was at that time? And could you talk about what impact she had?
Well, she was unusual in terms of her sexuality, because and even to this day, that's a difficult subject for people to talk about. But she was able to, still do good in the world despite that. And it really shouldn't matter who you love anyway. Love is love. And so I'm happy to hear that they're dedicating that statue to her, because she is well deserving of it. Not only based on the things that she did on the LGBTQ side, the religious side, and the law side. So it's good when we, start to recognize people for the greatness that they've done. And she certainly has done a lot of great.
And you're attending a school that Patricia Roberts Harris, who was a graduate of Howard University, she was actually the dean of the law school. She was the first Black woman to lead a dean at a major law school. As we all know, Patricia Roberts Harris went on to become the secretary, the first Black female secretary in a presidential cabinet, secretary of HUD. Then she became Secretary of Health, Education, and Welfare. And then that was folded into Health and Human Services. So Howard Law School has produced a great number of alum. And, we hear about, of course, Justice Marshall, but we also in the cities and towns around the country, Howard University lawyers actually make a difference in terms of serving their communities. And so, do we have Al now?
Oh my
Okay,
God.
well, boy, we're okay, no problem. Okay, so and so, could you talk about, even though you were in the law school, being a Howard person? How important is it to be a Howard person?
Howard instills you with so much pride, from the undergraduate level to the law school to the dental school to whatever school. If it's Howard, it's just there's just so much pride, because they really do just prepare you for life in general, and you want to do good, because you know the legacy that you come from, And so you want to get out there and you want to represent all the leaders that have come through that school. And you just want to continue that legacy in your own right. And it's just something about Howard, when you get there and you leave with your stories about everything that you went through, but you made it, and you're so proud to be a Howard alum. And we let everybody know everywhere we at. You told me this was the HBCU show today, so I got my Howard shirt on, and it just get filled up with so much pride. And you'll see it in any conversation that you have with the Howard alum, and even anyone that just attended Howard. They just, the memories that you make, you want everybody to know about it and let them know what they missed out on.
What do you think is the primary difference? Okay, we see Al. Okay, well, we're still struggling there. And the HBCU experience, we're going to bring on Sam Collins in a minute, but talk about just your opinions. In your opinion, in terms of because you've had both the PWI and the HBCU. Just talk briefly about the difference, if any.
Well, the only difference really was in how the white people treated you, because the black people at Penn State, we got along great. We had some of the best parties too up there. And when you're in such small numbers like that, you kind of get to know each other a little bit better. You want to hang out with each other a little better, and you feel safe about being around each other. So it was good in that regard. But for me at Howard, being in a major city, we called it Chocolate City at that time. And it's there's competition obviously amongst your colleagues and your classmates and everything, but it's all good fun, and we're all just striving to get that Howard education and to just go out and do our thing in this world and represent Howard and whatever schools we attend, and represent them well. And I think I know I've done the best I've could here in DC. I've mentored kids, I've coached them, I do seminars all the time on estate planning. I'm ANC commissioner, advisory neighborhood commissioner, which is a low-level political position in DC. For those of you that don't know, I clerked at the courthouse. I've been a prosecutor. I'm doing my own practice right now, and it's all because of the confidence that you get when you attend a school like Howard University and HBCUs. You just know that you're going to go out here, you're going to do well because they have prepared you, and now go do it. And I feel like they trained me very well to be a social engineer. I have no problem speaking my mind about something that I don't think is right, and I will let you know. And I credit Howard for that.
Fantastic. Do we have Al now? Okay. Well, that's what you're saying is great. We just can't hear you now. Sam, is Sam there? Hi, Sam Collins. How you doing?
Good morning. I'm doing well.
Yes, we got Sam.
Yes, we got Sam.
We got Sam. Yes.
Well, now, Sam, you attended George Washington University.
Yes, sir.
Before and let me just say, full disclosure, we work for the same newspaper, and Sam is all over Howard and the HBCU scene. But before we get to that, could you talk about, just maybe for about a minute, about being a African American student at George Washington University?
If I recall correctly, during the time I was there, we were about 6% or so. I'm not exactly sure how accurate that number was, but we were a small part of the population. So as a Black student, you're often very cognizant of how few of us there are. And looking back, I think that made us more intentional about how we related to one another. So coming on campus, It was very close knit, and we had older students, student leaders, whether they might have been part of the Divine Nine or part of student organizations. They often took it upon themselves to mentor the younger students and to bring them into the fold. We also had a multicultural student services center, and that was a place where a lot of us often congregated. So while we were at a PWI and we faced racial animosity, in a sense, it brought us closer together, and it was opportunities for us to foster relationships. And GW, as a whole, is a place where people are very gung ho about going above and beyond in whatever they're doing. So, that in addition to the solidarity that we had, really provided opportunities for networking among our people, and just really building on that level. There were a few setbacks, and I can speak more about that during the monologue, but at the same time, GW did offer some opportunities to realize what I am and what I'm not. So I'll leave it there for now.
That's an interesting perspective. Al, do we have you?
Nope.
Okay, well, you don't look like Carlton Banks, the old Carlton Banks, not the new Carlton Banks, the old Carlton Banks. So, how were you received on George Washington's campus in terms of your philosophy? Yeah.
A lot of what I espouse now, I didn't really do so until after graduate school. I spent about 6.5 years at GW. I would say a lot of my fellow alumni, we've clashed on certain issues, just being out of that bubble. But I would say that GW, in a sense, did temper some of that, just being one of the few on campus. But while it did temper it, I would say that given where I came from in DC and what DC was when I went to GW, I did bring some of that energy with me in terms of just being really passionate about Black people, Black issues, Black culture, and just letting that manifest in everything that I did. But as far as my current philosophy, a lot of that really grew after grad school. Just coming into my own and being out of that bubble. Once again, PWIs, they do temper that quite a bit because the goal is to, I guess, in a sense, integrate, and we're often very cognizant of how we look among the others. As a matter of fact, looking back once again, it was often, other Black people who I had to clash with at times, about how you refer to, local Washingtonians, how you dressed, things like that. It was, and for certain PWIs, the pipeline to a PWI is through the boarding schools. So a lot of us, I'm a public school graduate. So even with that, there are certain, and not to say like it's, from what I've been finding and speaking with HBCU students, there are certain class schisms as well. But I would say that at PWIs, it's a bit more pronounced. If you're on scholarship, you're coming from a public school, you're oftentimes among students who matriculated through the private or boarding schools. So by the time they get to college, they're molded in a certain way, or they have a certain outlook about what it is they want to accomplish and why. So you're often clashing with that, while you're going through certain microaggressions in the classroom and on campus within that Black bubble. There are often cultural and class differences that make you very privy to the differences that we have. And, it gets complicated, for some of us who don't have that foundation, I would say.
Mm-hmm. It's interesting. Al, are you with us? Okay, we're still. Let me just say that I think that your perspective is very important. Talk about, as a reporter, you're covering Howard. mainly, but that's the main school in terms of the university level. You also cover UDC, and on occasion you go to George Washington, AU. And just want to get a sense from you. What are you seeing in terms of Howard, what's going on with Howard, particularly with the protests that you had earlier this semester? What are you seeing now there?
People love Howard. People want Howard to uphold his legacy, and people respect what Howard has done and continues to do for students, faculty, community members, and alumni. And that love often shows itself in the way that students coalesce around issues that are concerning them. So in loving Howard, they love hard, and they show their love by attempting to hold administrators accountable. And just as is often the case at any other school, at Howard University, students will showcase their fervor for leadership and for change by organizing. And that's what I saw. That's what I've seen quite a lot this year. I've seen students uniting with alumni. I've seen alumni uniting with faculty members. I've seen faculty members uniting with community members all around what they understand Howard to be in terms of his legacy, and in holding administrators accountable to staying true to that legacy. Because oftentimes, like I said before, class schisms and conflicts between administrators and those of us at the so-called bottom, they often they often clash with what we understand to be the legacy. And that's not taken away from what Howard has accomplished, but in attempting to hold that legacy, we've seen students put administrators' feet to the fire. And there have been negotiations, from what I'm understanding and what I've talked to students about over the last couple of weeks. Howard is holding up his end of the bargain, but once again, that did not happen without protest. And let it be known, no pun intended, because that's the name of the show, but let it be known that that was not the first protest that Howard students had. If you can recall, the dates might get mixed up, but I believe it was in 2016, they had another protest. They had a protest during the late 90s with the late Chadwick Boseman around the consolidation of the schools that would have wiped out the fine arts schools. So Howard has a legacy of protest that's rooted in students' love for Black people and Black ran institutions.
Very, very, very good. Very good. Very insightful. Now, do we have Al? Is Al coming, or and I'm a graduate of an HBCU, and address this, Sam. Now this was back in the 80s, so yes, I'm dating myself. And when this is back in the 80s, when I would visit the University of Houston, I went to Prairie View A&M, at the University of Houston, or to Texas A&M, or I was home in Austin at the University of Texas. Some of the Black people had sort of snooty attitude who attended the University of Texas, and say, oh, you go there. Well, I go to the University of Texas, or I'm an Aggie, or I'm with the U of H. And, nobody really cared about that. But could you talk about that kind of, is there still that schism between people who attend Black colleges and people who attend PWIs? You're on mute.
I can't really speak to that because it's a very nuanced issue. If you don't mind, I would like to read something that I wrote last night that sort of attempts to make sense of all of this. Just because it's not as clear cut as as we often try to make it, and I understand that we're trying to make sense of it, but it's much more complicated. And I think that it comes down to certain things that are well beyond what school you go to. So I can start if you don't mind, just in the interest of time.
Go ahead.
Okay. At the age of 32, I've adopted a race-first, nation-building mindset that's grounded in an affinity for everything African. For nearly a decade, I have expressed that by working mostly for and with Black people in my work as a journalist, teacher, organizer, and budding entrepreneur. Though I would come into this holistic consciousness in my mid-20s, My experiences at a predominantly white institution preceded an awakening that has brought me into an African-centered paradigm. It's not far-fetched for a transformation of this kind to happen to whoever attends a PWI. For a Black person, a PWI experience can either make you run away from Blackness or heavily embrace it as a means of staying solid in a foreign land. I definitely did the latter. While in the belly of the beast that was George Washington University, I gained somewhat of a grasp of not only nation building's merits, but what immersion in a white-centered space can do to one's psyche. At GW, while in a writing class, I learned and wrote about the US government's conspiracy to assassinate Malcolm X. I also founded a multicultural publication and assumed leadership roles in Black student organizations. Within that same period of time, I experienced racial profiling on numerous occasions. I also encountered Black people who, even though they shared the same skin color as me, looked down upon anything overtly Black and often discouraged me from using vernacular that Black Washingtonians use. Some of those Black people attended boarding and private high schools, whereas I came from a public high school. It was clear to see that from a young age, many of my peers had been primed to fight for the title of what is known as the HNIC, and I'll leave it at that. You guys know what that means. Doing so often meant absolving oneself of their uninhibited Blackness and fighting for unity with other groups rather than reconciling differences within our community. Let me be clear, this just does not happen at PWIs. As I said earlier, HBCUs, by virtue of being predominantly Black spaces, highlight class stratification among student body members, and in administration's tenuous relationships with students and faculty. Some HBCU students who ridiculed me and my peers for attending PWIs, from what I understand, came from boarding schools and upper middle class backgrounds and racially integrated environments. They also harbored classist attitudes towards district residents who they derogatorily call locals. Though they had somewhat of a Black consciousness, some of these students' mindsets mirrored that of their PWI counterparts. Now, that's not taken away from what HBCUs have been able to accomplish. By the end of the day, a failure to provide nuance when speaking about PWI and HBCUs does no one any good. When speaking about what types of people come out of these institutions, we must also take into account their upbringing and the values that have been inculcated throughout their life before attending college. We also must ask the question of what environment best serves Black students. I wouldn't make a blanket statement once again because the answer depends on the campus and the student. I'm not entirely sure what I would have done if given the chance again. I do know that I would encourage my future children to consider an HBCU, and I would do everything in my power to expose them to those options. At the same time, I will let them know that expecting a utopian society devoid of racial and class conflict is immature. We cannot escape Babylon. What we can do instead is destroy, to the best of our abilities, the Babylon that is within us. As I look back on my life, I think back on my upbringing in Chocolate City and my journey through an overtly Black DC public school system throughout the 1990s and early 2000s. From attending go-go's as a teenager, to reciting Lift Every Voice and Sing, to learning about numerous Black figures in schools, I gained a truly Black-centered experience that stayed with me as I fought my way to a bachelor's degree. That exposure to DC culture and my affinity for my Liberian heritage shielded me from the miseducation of the Negro, as Carter G. Woodson described, that showed up within Black PWI and Black HBCU students that I encountered. I say all of that to demand that in our discussions about HBCUs and PWIs, we ask ourselves that whether as a community we are doing what is necessary to instill a love for self within our young people at a very young age. If we are not doing so, then the college of choice is of no consequence.
Thank you so much, Sam. And Al?
Can you hear me now?
Okay, now we can hear you.
Are you getting an echo too or not?
we don't have a lot of time.
Okay.
Could you just give your comments?
Yeah, well, first of all, I'm the editor of Insight News in Minneapolis, Minnesota, not the Spokesman Recorder, but that's a great publication as well. I am a product of an HBCU as well. I started my college career at Morehouse College in Atlanta, and I love Morehouse. I love being in the environment. What it meant to me was affirmation, a sense of community, a sense of possibility. They instilled, I believe, an idea that you have both an obligation and a duty to create the world. And so I moved in my professional career as a business owner, as a journalist and publisher, with the idea that every thought, every word, every sound I make is a contribution towards reimagining what existence is, what the universe is. And I have the belief, and I think our HBCU experience engenders this, that we can take ownership of the future. It's ours to do. And that the change we're looking for in the world is both inevitable and imminent. So what we do right now is critical. And I really love what my brother just said, on point. So I've been listening to Greg Carr, Dr. Greg Carr and Karen Hunter with the narrative. I'm kind of an advocate of what they're saying. I've heard Dr. Greg Carr talk about jailbreaking the university. He's been supportive of the student activism at Howard University. He's been an advocate. And what he said is that the pandemic itself and all the things around it, that amplified by the George Floyd and the litany of other catastrophic experiences that we're seeing, and in ways that are unavoidable, that the world is seeing, that all of that is shaking this idea that we have to be junior white people. We can be authentically Black, and we can look to Blackness, and we can in fact look to antiquity, the historicity of our existence, to find a pathway to the future. I believe that what will happen in education is that we will begin to really deeply think about, imagine, reflect on, reconnect with, rediscover the origin of civilization, that origin is within us, and that we bear the retention of that our history doesn't begin with slavery, it begins with the creation of civilization. And as we begin to re-embrace that primal opportunity of creating civilization out of nothingness, we will be once again innovators and create the next iteration of what it means to be a human being in the cosmos today. It's a big order. I think we're up to it.
Thank you very much. And we are going to close. Let me just say two things. Let me just say that if you know of an HBCU student who needs some money to go to college, we have a Chevrolet National Newspaper Publishers Association's expanded Discover the Unexpected Fellowship 2022 Summer Scholarships. And there's a great deal of experience here for that. And it's a 10-week summer internship from June the 7th to April the 14th. Each fellow will receive $10,000 scholarship, a $5,000 stipend, and 2022 Bold EV access. And finally, register for the NNPA Summer Convention in New Orleans. And it's from June the 22nd to the 25th. And the great Stephanie Mills will be entertaining. So thank you, Vicki Wright-Smith. Thank you, my colleague, Sam Collins. And thank you, Al Farlane from the Insight News. I got it right. Thank you. And we look forward to seeing you tomorrow on Let It Be Known.